Good evening.
Good afternoon.
I'm Hannah White. Welcome to this Institute for Government and Onward event on a nice, simple topic of how to rewire government to get things done. As may already be evident, this is my fifth party conference and my final event, so I may be somewhat incoherent. Apologies for that in advance. But the advantage of having been to five-party conferences this year is I have some points of comparison between them, and it's been very interesting over the last couple of days to see what emerging ideas there are coming from the Conservative Party about the future of government, what the future of a Conservative government might look like. While still very much, I think, is clear from many of the discussions I've been in and observed, under the shadow of the riposte. Well, you were just in government, so why didn't you do that? Or aren't you just trying to solve the problems that you have created? But I think that is obviously the issue that the Conservative Party is having to grapple with at this moment. But it is also a sign of one of the great advantages that the Conservative Party has of a lot of very recent experience of just how difficult it is to get things done in government. And that's by virtue both of the way in which the state is configured, but also the context, the fiscal context in which we find ourselves. I have to say, having been at the Reform and Green conferences, there was a blissful lack of awareness of some of the difficulties of some of the things that they might have been proposing and how it would be to get those things done in government, although I understand from the latest reporting that Kent County Council is coming up against the realities of how difficult it might be there to doge your way to massive savings in local government. So we may see more of that as the Parliament proceeds. But of course, there was a lot of the Labour Party conference, a lot of similarities actually in terms of a dawning realisation that actually being in government isn't all that easy, and just being the Labour Party doesn't make it miraculously easier to get things done. And interestingly, quite a lot of shared questions arising that I've seen discussed here in fringe events about the relationship between ministers and government, the role of quangos and political control and those sorts of things. So Keir Starmer has said that he has already concluded that having had a go at being in government, he thinks we need to rewire the state. And so we thought it would be really interesting to have this conversation this evening to talk a little bit about what that might look like. I'm delighted we've got a brilliant panel here to have this discussion. I'm going to ask them each to kick off with a few thoughts. Then we'll have a bit of a discussion in the panel, and then we'll make sure I will leave plenty of time for all your questions. Thank you so much for joining us, and please have those questions ready. So Eve Norwich is Head of Research at Onward, and will you kick us off, Eve, with a few thoughts on that sort of broadest context? Set the scene for us in terms of what you think the emerging priorities ought to be in terms of this thought about how you would go about rewiring the state.
Sure. Thank you, Hannah, and thank you all very much for coming. It's lovely to see you here today. I really wanted to start this session off actually on a positive note. I feel like we're likely to spend this hour talking about a lot of things that need to change within the British state and about how it is wired. That is why you've come along today. But, the current government has faced quite a bit of criticism, and from business particularly, that they've spent too much time talking our country down. So I really thought, let's not fall into that trap. I've lived in a few different countries, France, Hong Kong, and briefly Dubai. And I would say, just to start, by international standards, we are very fortunate in this country, right? The British state is incredibly well developed. I've worked in a few different parts of it. I was a political advisor under David Cameron. I've also worked in the civil service. I've worked for a regulator. And I think we are really fortunate here to have a very strong, well-developed, historically tested machinery of government, and that is something that I think we should celebrate. So that was just where I wanted to start. However, there is a but. We are, let's face it, facing some massive challenges. as a country right now. And in the face of those challenges, I think, there is no doubt the British state is going to have to step up. I think it's also going to have to keep up in the face of rapid technological change that we're seeing across society as a whole, right? It can't be left behind. The first of those challenges, I think, is the dire state of the public finances, as we all know. I'm not going to talk about that in too much detail. I know Caroline's going to come on to that. But I think just to say that really at the moment everything needs to be done as efficiently and as economically as possible because there just is no spare money. The second challenge that I just wanted to mention, I think, is political and really relates to our democracy and to our machinery of democratic accountability. The civil service is politically impartial, but I think it is an open secret, that there does tend to be greater alignment amongst public sector workers with certain political views than others. And I think that's no surprise, right, when you consider that people working in the public sector have actively chosen to pursue a career in public service rather than, for example, a career in business. And I know that was something that many, Conservative ministers did have to grapple with to some extent in government. I thought there was an interesting study that I was just going to mention from King's College London last year, which highlighted that government workers who align politically with the government they are working for show higher job satisfaction, they are prouder of their work, and they are more willing to work harder than those who do not support the government that they're working for. I mean, that seems to make sense, right? And I suppose in the light of that, I want to highlight that multiple polls at the moment are demonstrating that the British people, and particularly young people, are really losing trust in government and faith in democracy. I don't know if any of you attended yesterday. Onward did an event called Winning Back Tomorrow, where we shared the findings of a major polling study that we published this weekend in partnership with the Konrad Adenauer Foundation and the polling agency JLP. And this study looked at the views and experiences of young people across the country. We talked to 5,000 of them, and how the Conservative Party might start to win them back. And I think a really interesting and deeply concerning finding from that work is that 60% of under 40s think that either that democracy in the UK doesn't work well and that too many people are ignored, that was 40% said that, or that democracy in the UK is completely broken. That was 20% who said that. And I suppose I bring that up because if the polls are anything to go by, right, there is a decent chance that we may see a reform government in 4 years' time. Obviously, we're working to try and stop that happening, but it is, at the moment, we have to face that reality. And I suspect that there may be even less political alignment between the civil service and Reform UK than there has been with the Conservatives. And I do think there's potential for that to have some serious implications for the state's delivery of the policy platform of a democratically elected government. So I do wonder, given where we're at in terms of trust of democracy, it's vitally important that we think about the implications of that for our political system. I do wonder whether we need to be seriously thinking about whether there needs to be space for more, politically appointed roles. I'm not talking about proliferation of spads who, worked for MPs and worked their way into government positions, but people who have genuine technical expertise but who are perhaps freed from those requirements that civil service has to be politically impartial and can really be unleashed to deliver the policy platform of the government that they're serving. And then just finally, so I've probably gone on too long already, but I just wanted to touch on technology. I think the British state hasn't had a great track record of integrating this well. But I think there are some really positive signs at the moment, which started on the Conservatives, actually. I think even the creation under Rishi Sunak of the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology was a really positive step in terms of creating a mandate to drive forward technological change, both in society and in the public sector. I know that the current government has recently announced a set of AI tools for government, I think aptly named Humphrey, for those in the room who've ever enjoyed Yes Minister. But I think that sort of change has the potential, right, to be unlocking some really good things in terms of the wiring of the state. And this is not just in terms of efficiency savings, but in terms of the opportunities to make government faster and more responsive to the needs of the British people.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Eve. And maybe picking up on some of those themes, Caroline Elsom is Head of Reshaping the State. What a fantastic title. Onward. If you could just fix that for us, Caroline, that would be excellent. But
I'll do my best. So I'll pick straight back up where Eva's left off. And sort of take the question very literally about rewiring the state and start on the chronic underinvestment in technology and information systems in government, which really are making it so difficult to get anything done. Before I joined Onward, I was a special advisor in several departments, so I've seen firsthand the great frustration that ministers find when they come in with the best of intentions and the best made plans, and then find as soon as they get there that they get caught up in the sludge, and that is regardless of party. And then obviously when you have the Labour Party coming in with no plan at all and hoping that they can cobble it together when they get there and that the civil service will come up with this fantastic plan for them, it doesn't work. So even the parts of government where there has been some really big investments in technology, I'm thinking of the NHS, where the federated data platform has been rolled out over the last few years in acute trusts. Even where that has happened, it's still coming up against loads of antiquated paper-based systems or spreadsheets that then still exist in silos, and we're failing to utilise the tech even when we've spent millions, sometimes billions of pounds on it. So it's a really important thing that we don't just need a proper tech-enabled backbone of government. We need to actually make sure that we're using it to its maximum advantage. And then I'll go on to my own personal grumbles from, I've been both a special advisor and a civil servant before that, so I've been both the one creating the advice and then trying to get things done as a result of it. But the commissioning system by which ministers ask for policy advice within government is so slow. Time and time again, you will ask for information from civil servants and it will take weeks, if not months, to get a simple factual answer back. And if those civil servants who are, not acting with any malevolence or malintention usually, just the slow pace of change means that either by the time that information has come back, it's out of date, or it's no longer relevant to the current situation, or it's incomplete. They've misinterpreted the question, and then you have to go round and round and round again. But if you had a proper tech-enabled backbone of government where ministers could do things like, as you would to ChatGPT, ask a simple question, get a simple factual answer back, that could really, really speed up the pace of change in a really transformational way. So I like Eve. I'm positive about what we could do. We've just got to make sure those systems get in and we start to get it right. And we've seen what happens when government by spreadsheet goes wrong. We've seen it during the pandemic when there were multiple examples of the sort of computer says no, or we've run out of space on the Excel sheet and it doesn't work, or indeed with the recent Afghan example where if you're emailing things backwards and forwards that really should be secure, there's a lot of risk in that. So I think often it can be overblown the extent to which bringing these new tech systems into government is a danger. And yes, of course, there are security issues with it, but there's also really deep security issues with not coming up to date with the pace of change and not using some of the new systems to their full advantage. I'll add in a couple of final points on it wouldn't be a Tory conference without talking about quangos and how we really, really need to bear down on the number of quangos and what they are doing in government. 60% of day-to-day spending goes via quangos. That is a huge amount of money that ministers only have a very sort of loose grip over what's going on over, because it's just too difficult to get that information backwards and forwards. So we really do need to do something about that. And Labour, Keir Starmer talked a big game about, I think he said he was going to fight the flab and cut down on quangos, but instead, within the first 6 months, he had announced 18 new quangos. So the idea that they're getting a grip on any of that is just totally fanciful. And then I said I would say something about the state of the public finances. I'll just do a quick word on the OBR recently put out their assessment of the long-term fiscal risks and the debt to GDP ratio that we are facing as we go into the next 50 years. And their prediction, their estimate, it's not a prediction, their estimate is that by the mid-2070s, our debt to GDP ratio will reach 270% of GDP, which is, of course, shocking and eye-watering. That is based on productivity being at 1.5%. we haven't had productivity of 1.5% since before the financial crisis. So if you actually use our current rate of productivity, which is 0.5%, our debt to GDP ratio by the mid-2070s will be 650% of GDP. It won't happen. It cannot happen. There is no way that we can carry on like this with an ever larger state doing less, as in delivering less value for money. So we really do need to get a grip on this, and we urgently need to rewire the state. I'll leave it there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Alex, one of the things, so Alex Thomas is from the Institute for Government, leads our civil service work, and was the brains behind this report, which we have adorning our desks here, on the centre of government. We've had brilliant context from Eve and from Caroline on the sort of the wider issues. One of the things we really wanted to drill into before the election by running this cross-party commission was this thing that we have heard, we used to hear from the Conservative succession of Conservative governments, and we've heard again from Labour, this sense that when you're sitting at the centre of government, you pull a lever and it doesn't appear to be attached to anything. And so we wanted to look at what the actual issues were with the centre of government. So would you tell us a little bit about our thinking on that?
Thanks, Hannah. Yeah, I'll touch on the centre of government and then a bit about the civil service, picking up some of the points that Caroline and Eve have made. But also on this report, thank you for the shout out. We were joking with Jesse beforehand that he had to read it before he made his contribution, and I think you finished it, Jesse. Through. The centre of government, as Hannah just said, very striking, the frustration, for all of us watching it, but also for those ministers and officials working in the centre of government in the succession of Conservative governments up to 2024, and now in the Labour government coming in, a real sense of frustration. So in this, I won't go through all the arguments there, but we talked about various problems with the lack of strategic capacity in number 10, the bloated and duplicatory cabinet office, and how that was leading to an ineffective set of both relationships and then decision making in the centre, and made various suggestions about how to kind of clean that up, create a department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet to properly support what the Prime Minister is as a Chief Executive of Government, and to provide more impetus and drive behind civil service reform and the government reform agenda, again, as we're seeing now. But you can read that all for yourself, so I won't labour the point. But I do think it has been very striking seeing a new government come in and wrestle with all of these problems with the centre. One of the lines that we've been using for a long time, which is that the UK is a highly centralised country, but with an ineffective centre, and really important that you don't fall into the trap that successive governments have of responding to that weak and ineffective centre by trying to hoard everything in the centre and run everything from the centre, but actually to create a set of leadership structures and organisational structures that help the centre do what only it can do, which is set direction, set strategic direction, give a sense of momentum and an organising principle for the government, while then kind of freeing up, whether it's secretaries of state in their government departments, or mayors or local authorities, or other parts of the state and the wider public sector to achieve the government's objectives. So still quite a lot of work to do with the centre, and we'll see Labour government started to make some changes on that. It was interesting to see Darren Jones coming in as Chief Secretary to the Prime Minister, this new confected job. But if he is able to kind of clean up the centre and kind of drive through delivery from there, that will be, it's in line with some of the stuff that we talk about in here. So interesting to see if that starts to work for them. On the civil service more generally, all interested to see Mel Stride's stuff yesterday about reducing the size of the civil service. All governments say they're going to do that, including the current one. Let's see. I would like to come at, this is a very IFG perspective, so interested in the collective views in the room on whether you agree or not. But I would like to come at reducing the size and the cost of the civil service through improving the effectiveness of the civil service lens, rather than just a saving money lens, because certainly, and we talk to civil servants the whole time, the real damage that an ineffective civil service does to the country isn't the few £billion here or there that it might cost. That is important, and I don't underplay that. But it's actually duplication, a multiplication of task forces and units and confused organisational structures. So the benefits that I would see would be a kind of real a deduplication. Have I got that right now? I said that wrong. Anyway, you know what I mean. And a much more sort of clearer set of arrangements. And I think to Caroline's point about pace, one of the obstacles to pace in the central civil service, at least, is layers of clearances and checks and things. So you make an absolutely a fair and good point about technology and the mechanics of it, but why does a minister or special advisor ask a question and it takes 2 weeks to get an answer that should be relatively simple? It's because it gets gummed up in the system with everybody trying to clear it and sense check it and fact check it, and it gets further and further away from the original ask. So a more effective civil service, I think, is part of the answer there. On the kind of politicization and alignment point, I think sometimes we can get a bit distracted with this argument about, by all means appoint some more special advisors. That's fine. It needs to be done in the right way. I'm more interested, and we've done lots of work on this at the IFG, in what we've called kind of opening up the civil service, so cracking it open, not saying, well, let's allow ministers to make a few more appointments here and there, or relying on ministers to happen to know the best person who will be able to deliver the project or do the thing, but to change civil service recruitment practices so that you get more outsiders, you get more people with the skills that can that need to be used at any particular time, and more circulation between not just the private sector and the civil service, but the wider public sector and civil society and so on. So I would come at that question, or I do come at that question, less in a kind of should we have politically aligned people who might be a little bit more motivated but less permanent, and more about how do we get the right people into the civil service. I'm also concerned about. We're doing a project at the moment. The real answer, I think, to some of these problems is to restore a relationship of confidence and trust between ministers and civil servants at the top of the office. And it's been very striking that, to some extent, that relationship, not universally by any means, but started to break down under the last set of Conservative governments, and is now in danger of breaking down under a Labour government. And if we could restore a set of kind of confidence and professional collaborative working together, that would be a good thing. I will stop in a moment because I've already talked more than I intended to, but I think there are some talk about rewiring the state. We should look at the accounting officer model that makes it very hard to properly set up projects and, crucially, budgets that cross departmental boundaries, and is also an obstacle to, its elbows out secretaries of state and permanent secretaries when you've got initiatives that need to be driven from the centre to improve the way the state works. And I also think I think there's sort of some constitutional questions around that, but we need to look at the accounting officer model. And then finally, on the sort of wider public services, and call them arm's length bodies if you're sympathetic, quangos if you're not. But it is striking how the last Conservative government and this Labour government have got frustrated with the lack of control over the levers. My only note of caution on that is I think that can become a sort of, it's a bit of an easy line, and it can be a distraction from governments really grappling with some of the real underlying policy questions. So the example of Natural England always comes up. Fine, I'm sure Natural England can work more effectively, and ministers might want to take a more direct oversight of Natural England, but that's not going to solve your fundamental question about whether you want to tilt the planning system towards protecting spiders or building houses. So ministers still need to ministers can't use the kind of quango state critique to avoid taking responsibility for those policy choices.
Thanks very much, Alex. Jesse, I'm conscious that the conversation we've had so far has tended to the technocratic, has been about people, has been about processes, institutions, and how to set them up for success. Can you give us the sort of the political lens on this? You've got this such an interesting role as shadow leader of the House of Commons, which is not just about how government, a future Conservative government would achieve, would deliver its legislation, would achieve what it wants through Parliament, but it's about that intersection, I think, between what government does and the need for government to be legitimate, to have that representative legitimacy via the parliamentary system, and for those things to be in interplay. So really interested to hear your reflections on this question.
Wow, well, thank you very much indeed, Hannah, and thank you everyone for coming along. Of course, the exam question is, how should governments rewire the state to get things done? And people's views of what the state is can differ. And you've invited me to think about the politics of this, and that potentially would involve thinking about the role of Parliament and whether that's part of the state or not. I don't know how you're defining it. I tend to think of it as outside. I tend to think of it as a governing break on executive power as exercised through the state. But there's no doubt that the relationship between effective leadership within the executive and effective working with colleagues across Parliament can be quite influential, can make quite a difference. And there's been an unfortunate tendency of Prime Ministers with large majorities to despise Parliament, and tragically, this latest one isn't an exception to that rule. And I always think that's a terrible mistake, because there's a lot of quality there. I mean, I would say this, wouldn't I? But I've also been on the other side of the equation. I've been in 4 or 5 or 6 departments. So let me just make some comments on what's been said, because I think it's a very interesting question. I mean, what underlies the whole question, in a way, is this issue of a perception of failed effectiveness, failed capability. And that then raises a deep question of legitimacy. By what right do we put these people in their places to deliver for us if they're not delivering? And it also raises a question, therefore, when that legitimacy crumbles or is not delivering, of public trust. You know, what are we doing electing these numpties or choosing these numpties to execute policy if they're not doing their job? So these are deep issues. I do think, just to pick up on something Caroline said, that let's be clear, AI is not the answer, right? This is not a technology problem in a way that, the way of connecting the levers of power to ministerial arms is not by, or not only by, a bit of improvement in technology. It absolutely could be by significantly more investment in actually linking things together, because one of the things you realise when you're in government is how shockingly bad the information is, in many cases, on which you're being asked to work. And I remember being at the DFT, and one of the things I said was, look, why don't we get ChatGPT on every civil servant's desk? Because, provided you use it smart, in an intelligent way, it might actually increase productivity. And DFT being a rather go-ahead department, this was thought to be very interesting and put into a 6-month training process while they evaluated the idea. I also tried to get the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, later Prime Minister, to give me some more money to fund HMRC technology in the case of the furlough scheme, because, so you all know, with the furlough scheme, which I was running during COVID, money went to people we didn't want it to go to, and not enough money went to who we did want it to go to. That was because we were splicing together 2 crap databases on 2 Ataris, you don't know that, and 4 Commodores, at the HMRC, and it's very hard to do that on no notice, which is what a candidate gives you. And so investment would be a good idea. So I'm a big fan of intelligent investment infrastructure, especially technology infrastructure. But it's not the answer. Where I think, I mean, there are lots of points where one can have disagreements with this, and there's always a danger with principles of being motherhood and apple pie, and of proposals for being insufficiently contextualized to give you real traction. And this really does require sensitive, considered thought by the next government. And I'm sure it will be scrutinised on that basis by senior figures across the Conservative Party, because that's what the next government will be. That's a provocation, by the way, ladies. I was expecting a reaction to that, very good, one way or the other. But the point I would make is that the one area where I don't think there's any ambiguity is the loss of strategic focus. And that comes in two forms. One is the incentives posed by 24-hour media and 3-year budget cycles and a perennial panic about cash in the face of the current debt situation that we have, to reinforce massively short-term incentives. And the third comes from something you're not going to particularly like, which is the lack of enough people in and across the civil service with suitable independence of mind to be able to say, actually, do you know what? Is it such a good idea, Prime Minister, to layer the Hong Kong, Syria, Afghan and Ukrainian legal migration programs on top of each other? Might just, paradoxically, this might conceivably lead to some adverse political outcomes. And we could really do with both those things. With more strategic intelligence, like driving something, giving it a longer term structure and focus, and also more, hold on a second, are you absolutely sure you know what you're doing? Because decisions you're taking now could be counterproductive. It's easy to mock Quangos or ALBs. They're some of the few areas where long-term policy is actually taking place. I mean, one of the achievements actually was to create the road investment schemes, because it took the road investment process out from under, for strategic roads, out from under DFT. We haven't done that yet with local roads. That would be a very good thing, out from under HMT, I should say. So at the moment, you have local roads which are funded at the end of the year. Any councillors in the room, great news, pothole fund, March. Wouldn't it be better if we had a 5-year local road system, which you could actually just invest in, you know where you are. They don't like it in the Treasury, but then that isn't the only test of good policy. In fact, it's almost always the negative test of good policy. I do think that the question of how we balance the Treasury, and I say this as a former financial secretary, is quite a serious issue. I mean, the average age of the Treasury is 28. You've got a culture there where far too many younger civil servants are going in there with the best of incentives and intentions, spending a relatively short period of time in the department. And of course, inevitably, you get inexperienced decision-making. And because it's a very, very flat department, that then percolates up into senior bods and I think contributes to a short-term focus. And of course, it's completely abetted by rules which require you to compete every decision that you can make. That has a very adverse effect in the Treasury. It means you can't say to someone, or indeed every other department, oh, bad news, Ahmed, Jane, Jim, Bill, whatever your name is, we're sending you now to spend a couple of years sorting out the payments system. It's a really rubbish job. We really apologise, but the good news is we'll put you in the Permanent Secretary's office for a couple of years after that. You can't do that. That's not actually legal under current employment policy within the civil service. Equally, you can't say to someone who's presented a CV to you for an application inside the civil service, can we just interview your previous boss to see if you're any good or not? Can't do that. So, of course, the result of that is, hopeless negative selection where third-raters do not get adequately scrutinised except by all kinds of devious around-the-corner methods. So that's not a particularly clever way of setting incentives either. A couple of quick things. Capability really matters. Choosing ministers who know what they're doing, have got some experience, really makes a difference. Who knew? I mean, really. That really makes a difference. Civil servants get on very well with ministers who know their own mind and know how to take responsibility and execute decisions. What they can't deal with is dither, delay, lack of clarity. So we shouldn't be beating up our civil servants. I mean, we can, by the way. There are other ways of doing that perfectly properly. The civil servant who thought it was a great idea to commission a £106 million bat protector for HS2 without any knowledge of how you actually do protect bats for 50 pairs of Bechstein bats, how that happened is catastrophic. The idea that HS2 should have required a client board within the Department of Transport of 800 people in order to scrutinise that organisation is astounding, but so let's. I'm not, as it were, exculpating the civil service from any responsibility in this area, but I do think that a lot of the problem gets solved if you're smarter about capabilities, both amongst civil servants and amongst ministers. And then the final point I'd make, just while I'm on this little mild rant, is that I do think, I actually initiated a training program for ministers when I was at Treasury. And I naturally thought, I know exactly what's going to happen, which is my body will be found charred in a ditch somewhere no one's ever heard of. Because everyone's, living with imposter syndrome designed to disguise how inadequate they are at their jobs across, in fact, life generally. And actually, that wasn't true. It turned out ministers were absolutely thrilled because actually, to give them an excuse to do that, we had some from Oxford come in who allowed us to pretend we knew what we were doing. We had some people who actually ran case studies, and the result was we got slightly better at commissioning projects, which is what we need to do. There's one very serious issue of culture, which isn't, I don't think, addressed in this book, which really could be, which is we have a civil service that's very, very horrid. I am absolutely not a wholesale critic of the civil service. I think we have to take a calibrated view to it as to any institution. But there is one thing which is a serious problem, which is, and it's something that the political system massively has cosseted and indeed kind of, in some senses, supported through legislation, which is this total preoccupation with due process. We have got to be more oriented towards outcomes. We've got to recruit people who are outcome-oriented. We've got to train them to be more outcome-oriented. We've got to pay them and promote them and support them if they achieve outcomes. And if they don't, if they just shilly-shally, if they let things get into silos, and we don't rebalance this with sensible discretion at all levels, then we will not be able to succeed. And I think we could give that topic a bit more attention than we have done in the past. And where we have done that, the results can be transformative, but they tend to be transformative in wartime or in crisis. And it'd be really nice to do it during peacetime as well.
Brilliant. So many things I'd like to pick up on there. I think if everyone doesn't mind, we're going to extend this by a couple of hours. No one has anywhere else to be. The one thing I'm very conscious of, I want to come to the room for questions. You've all made the time to come here, and I want to give you that opportunity. But something you could be under the misapprehension of listening to our conversation is that government is all about central government. And of course, one of the important things about rewiring the state is also thinking about the relationship between that underpowered centre that Alex was describing and local government, devolved government. Caroline, I feel you are the person who we ought to turn to give us some colour on the sort of challenges there.
I should declare at the top that I have skin in the game because I am a council candidate at the next election. I can see a couple of other council candidates in the room, so it's good to have you here as well. So my reflections on local government in particular are, again, how all the incentives are broken for both to get the right sort of councillors and then for them to do the sorts of things that we really want them to do once they're in the job. And what I mean by that is that so much of the money that is spent at local government goes on a very narrow range of things. About 50 to 80% of day-to-day spending at local government level is on adult social care or children's social care, depending on the demographics of that particular area. And of course, those policies are largely dictated from the top. This is not, local innovation and, trying to get the best or serve the area to meet their specific local needs. This is national policy being delivered at a local level. So what it does is it leaves very little room at a local level for innovation, for variation, to do things differently, to target to particular local needs. And I was struck actually by something that Angela Rayner announced before her leaving office over the summer, is that she announced a review of all of the duties that are placed on local authorities. And I dredged up a very old review of the duties on local government from 2011, which found that there were 1,300 statutory duties that local authorities have to discharge, which sounds like a lot already. But Angela's announcement was that there were in fact now so many duties placed on local government, probably more than 20,000, but we don't really know, that we were going to have to use AI to try and find them all, which is just baffling. And so the point here is that local government is being asked and dictated to do so much that is mandated from the top and not focusing on what best serves local need. And then the finance structure again is broken, that business rates, only half of them are retained, and that there is very little incentive for councillors to focus on local growth. And if we don't have local growth, then we don't have national growth. So I think there really does need to be a focus on how we would not just reshape the centre of government, but reshape local government and have some very big thinking about how we can change some of the structures there. And I think that also entails allowing councils who are reckless with their spending to fail. The system at the moment that we have with emergency financial support, which is when councils declare that they are effectively going bankrupt, just involves them having the deals in back rooms, MHCLG, to try and broker a deal to get them out of hot water, which is usually just asking them to take on more debt and then giving them very stringent terms on what they can and can't spend money on. But there is no automatic recall mechanism that means that people actually get a vote on whether those councillors should stay running the council. So I do think there needs to be a sort of a democratic mechanism as well to try and make this system work a bit better. I'll stop there for now.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to open up to questions in the room. I think we'll take them maybe in pairs. I don't think we do have a mic. Are you holding a mic at the back? That's not an umbrella. Yes, excellent. This gentleman here in the front. In fact, these two gentlemen here, seeing we could pass the mic between them. No, behind.
Hi, Jeremy Maddox. I'm chairman of the largest Conservative branch in the country in Fulham. Also, I'm a council candidate as well. I would disagree just slightly with Eve, is it? My experience of dealing with the civil service in Dubai has been pretty good, actually. But
I could tell
anyway.
you some stories.
Get sort of visas and certificates and whatever. But I think the problem with our civil service is that it's a sort of 18th century system that's become massively bloated and is, I'd say, pretty much not fit for the 21st century. And we perhaps need to take a more radical approach to looking at it and how it works, rather than tinkering around and trying to improve the beast. Actually change the beast completely. And I would say that what we need to be doing is reducing the number of civil servants, because the number of civil servants are incredibly expensive and unproductive compared to other people in the private sector. And the way to do that is to start looking at individual sectors and starting off with low-hanging fruit like DVLA and the passport office, etc., and working out how we can not just put it out to tender to another Quango, but put it out to competition so people can apply for a passport at maybe 1 of 2, 3, 4, 5 different centres, apply for a driving licence and manage it at different centres. Look at the private offices in government.
Do you have a question?
Yeah, I'm going to the question, but it's a bit different from what we've been talking about. So in the private offices, how can we, if ministers pulled a lever and that lever connected to Clifford Chance, who are giving the legal advice on a particular deportation, they would get an answer in half an hour, not in 2 weeks. And the problem is with the number of civil servants. So my question is, if you could look at some low-hanging fruit and how we could implement a privatisation of the civil service, where would you go first?
Thank you. Do you want to pass to your neighbour?
A very quick one on the Home Office, which comes in for a huge amount of criticism in relation to the migrant boats crisis. To what extent is there institutional paralysis within the system itself, or is it down to the lack of leadership from the Home Secretary?
Great. So one question on where we would start with privatising the civil service, what's the low-hanging fruit, and then a Home Office specific question, is it just a question of something inherent about the Home Office, or what is the problem there? We have actually done some work on the Home Office, haven't we, Alex? Do you want to kick that one off?
Thank you. Yeah, I knew you were going to come to me first, Hannah, with the defender of the civil service. It's a really interesting challenge. I mean, I don't agree with everything that you say there, and I think I also don't agree that civil servants are sort of uniquely unproductive. I think bureaucracies can become gummed up themselves, and whether that's a large private sector bureaucracy or a civil service bureaucracy, that's the problem. One of the things that we've argued for in the last few years is, I think, whether you call it sort of redundancy or a kind of more robust performance management process, the reason why large bureaucracies in the private sector can keep themselves, more nimble than they might otherwise be, is regular rounds of removing the poorest performers. And this is my way of slightly not answering your question about privatisation, but I do think there is something about trying to introduce those same sorts of incentives into the civil service where, I was a director in the civil service. There were probably, 320 odd people working for me. I absolutely knew that 10 of those shouldn't be doing the job, and you can argue about what the number is, but I was not incentivised in any way to properly deal with that poor performance. It was about moving them around the system. So I would come at the question in a different way, and I would think about how you change the incentives in the civil service, including some quite tough, kind of rigorous, hard-edged points like that redundancy point. And I would also do, to pick up on Jess's point about focusing on outcomes, I think there is too often a fetishisation of process in the civil service, and that manifests itself in terms of the HR policies or how it fails to address the churn in jobs and actually incentivising people for sticking around and doing the and getting promoted off the back of 5 years of core achievement rather than 18 months in 3 different jobs of work. And I think too often the focus is on we set targets that focus on outputs rather than outcomes. So I would come at it that way. I don't think there's some sort of privatisation sort of cracking open the system, and I think you're kind of phoning up Clifford Chance leaves me feeling quite queasy, because I think the bit of the civil service that it is most important to remain as part of the core institution are those parts where it's the government legal advice or the constitutional advice that ministers are getting. And I do think you can argue about how you might bring in other people or other advice, or privatise, if that's the word you choose, parts of the system. But actually it's quite important to have that capacity for impartial legal advice, on the phone to ministers as it exists. So I sort of quibble with the premise there. On the Home Office, yeah, it's been an unhappy institution in all sorts of ways, and it's probably a combination of all the factors that you focused on. I was very struck by, and I think she's spoken about it publicly, but the Shabana Mahmood episode where she really did crack heads together on the deportation the other day, and insisted that by the end of the day, by first thing tomorrow morning, we would have rewritten the policy on how the European Convention on Human Rights and how it was implemented, and that was done overnight, and she achieved the objective she was seeking to achieve. So a minister can absolutely kind of galvanise that system in that way, but what it's unreasonable to expect ministers to do is to be doing that on every single policy in every single way. So the question for the leadership of the Home Office is, how do you institutionalise that energy and dynamism, and yeah, the Home Office is a tough place to be.
Eve?
Yes, I think I would. I'm minded to agree with Alex as well. I think that what the civil service needs is more evolution than revolution, and I do think with really radical change, you could risk throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? And you could lose a lot of good things that are happening. That's not to say that it doesn't need to change. I think when you refer to privatisation, I wonder whether something that I do agree with is that the civil service needs to become a bit more like, a good business in the way it operates and runs. It needs to run more like an efficient, unified company, maybe a bit more like Tesco or Microsoft or Amazon, one of these really successful private sector businesses. I mean, just to share, I suppose, a bit of an anecdote of the type of thing that I'm talking about, I think there's not even a unified staff directory, right, in the civil service of every person that works in every government department. So in my previous role, I was asked to lead a piece of work on, and speak to everybody across government who's working on cost of living issues, right? I cannot tell you how difficult that was to do, because there's no way to look up those people and find out who they are. I mean, that's just nuts, right? If you talk to Tesco or Amazon or somebody, it's easy to identify who in that company works on what and why they're working on it. So I think there's real things that the civil service could pick up there. Just to pick up your point on numbers, I do think that with the advent of generative AI, there is actually an opportunity that there has not been before to potentially make some real efficiencies in terms of civil service numbers, just because a lot of the tasks that civil servants spend a lot of their time doing, which is things like writing briefing and reports and collecting databases of contacts, will be very easily done by AI. So that does require some serious thought, I think, as to where the civil service goes with that.
Jesse?
I don't think we should answer these questions anymore. I think we should take some more questions.
Okay.
I mean, excellent they have been. Thank you.
Okay, the gentleman in front here. So we've got a mic coming so everyone can hear.
Ewan Cameron, Hampstead and Highgate. It's maybe it's a genuine dilemma in my head. I don't understand why. In private enterprise, to Eve's point, I work in a multinational company. When a change of leadership happens, the chief exec's office focuses on key performance indicators. The whole organisation knows, well, that's what the boss is looking at. I'm going to change my behaviour to drive those KPIs. Surely, Jesse, when you go into a department, you sit down with your senior advisors, your leads of that, civil servants, and you say, listen, I'm not actually that interested, for instance, in NHS about the queue of ambulances outside. I want to know how we're doing against avoidable deaths, for instance. I want to know about genuine care. I want to know about the impact we're actually having relative to international markets with regard to healthcare in that example. Why is it we haven't done that? Because as I said, in the corporate world, to your point, if we don't do it, share price doesn't perform the way we want it to.
Great. Lady here in the front.
Thank you. Dawn Dainton, Unitary Councillor in Somerset. I go into meetings and I'm asked to make a decision, and it feels like I'm sitting on a plane. Madam, would you like chicken or beef? And you say, I'd like beef, and they say, we don't have any beef. And so you are almost funneled into a decision. You're given the option to have an option, but there is no other option. So I want to know if that transformation has to happen at central government, or does that mean we need to bring more decision, more power, more opportunity to the local level so that we can have real impact on decisions? Thank you.
Great. I think that first question probably for you.
Fantastic question. Yeah, let me just so thank you very much indeed for the question, Ewan. I mean, a good minister and a good Secretary of State will set priorities from the outset to civil servants and will insist that those be reflected in civil service. Of course, don't forget, ministers do not work for the Secretary of State, they work for the Prime Minister. So some ministers may not get with the programme, but if you're a junior minister and you are a constructive and thoughtful human being, which many of them are, you will want to work with your Secretary of State and your colleagues to deliver those outcomes. It is vastly more complex than it is in a simple world of a company, because in a company you know what you're going to do, you're trying to get more profit and you can measure it, it's very clear, etc. In government, you've got your priorities, that's fine. Then the Sun newspaper shows something that's different from your priorities. By the way, the civil servant saying, of course, we love your priorities, Minister, but have you thought about the statutory duties we're under in relation to XYZPQR or the possibility of being JR'd? Or it's very, very complex. You've got to remember that. That doesn't mean to say good things don't get done, but it means you've really got to be on your game. This goes back to one of our capability on both sides of the equation. On the point about options in local government, I completely understand. We desperately need more devolution to local government. Of course we do. The point that was made about local government being essentially an adjunct to adult social care and child social care is quite right. In Herefordshire, we've managed to optimise that by having a gerontocracy in Herefordshire of older people who naturally come to the world's nicest place to live out the remainder of their years, but a huge child social care problem as well, brilliantly. Don't know how we've managed it, but we've managed to do that. And no money, so that's an interesting combination. The counterpart, though, is you have to have empowered structures which allow councillors who are part-time unpaid, although as we now know that incentives are being tweaked in terms of pensions and things, to be able to exercise the kind of engagement that a minister would have in central government. If you're a minister and someone presents you with, chicken or beef, I say, so I can show me the wontons. Where's my veggie alternative? I want to see. I want to see. Show me some choice, which allows me freedom of action to make some decisions. And by the way, I'm not happy with that. Take it back. If a minister isn't doing that, they're not doing their job. Right, hard to do that in local government. There isn't as much time. The officials tend to have more relative time and priority. Also, in many ways, they're not as good sometimes as they should be. Can I say that? So I think that all of that has a constraint. It would be solved by, as all problems in politics are solved, by more responsibility, because with responsibility probably goes a bit more power and a bit more money.
Do you agree with that, Carla?
Largely, yes. So starting on this one, I mean, I've had a look at some of Labour's plans about devolution, and there are definitely some good parts about it. But I think I'm particularly worried about the move to wider use of mayoralties, and I'm worried about that because. Scarred, like many people are, from living in Sadiq Khan's London, where he has radically ratcheted up the amount of tax that he is taking out of council tax bills, and the public have so little understanding about where money goes when it's leveraged through council tax. In Wandsworth, where I am, next year the London Mayor will be taking a higher proportion of council tax than goes to the local council itself. So I think we just need to be really careful about how we do that localisation piece and where the incentives are. And I mean, I would do separate bills for different parts of of where money goes locally, just so it's really, really clear to the public about what their choices are, where their money is being spent, so that there is better accountability over what's happening at a local level. So I think it's got to be a bit of a give and take when you're talking about the sorts of options, and all bad options. I'm very familiar with the only being presented with terrible options piece. On the question from the gentleman over here about performance indicators, and actually the example that you gave of ambulances weighs heavily on my mind as the person who used to be the special advisor in charge of several winters of urgent and emergency care, and it illustrates the point perfectly that ambulances, we tried to change some of the incentives there, where the targets for urgent and emergency care were all about the 4-hour waits in A&E, all about what happens in the hospital, whereas the people who are most at risk in an urgent and emergency care situation are the people lying on the floor in their kitchens having fallen over, and nobody's monitoring that. And so therefore not monitoring that, not having that as a performance indicator, the amount of time that somebody's waiting on the floor before anybody's getting to them, means that wasn't the focus. So there was a lot of focus in the last few years of the last government on trying to get some of those indicators right, so that we were incentivising the right sort of behaviour at an NHS level and then at a departmental level. So we've got to be really careful about chasing targets and what the indicators are that we're using in government.
Brilliant. I think we've got time for another set of questions. Just here in the green tie.
Hello, Jack Richardson, a member in Melton and Sizeston. You mentioned about the possibility of creating a Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, but something else we haven't touched upon is actually the physical location of the civil service, no matter what size. And the previous government set up the Darlington Economic Campus for parts of the Treasury and other departments. And I think Liz Truss, if I remember rightly, said in her book that the building of Downing Street itself is too small to support the role of a modern Prime Minister. So what are your takes on actually moving civil service departments out of London and potentially moving the Prime Minister's physical office out of number 10?
Lovely. And then over there in the corner.
Yeah, Stephen Kerr, member of the Scottish Parliament. If you're scarred living in London, live under the SNP for the last 20 years, you'll know what scarring is really all about. I think there are massive gaps in the wiring of the modern British state in relation to the intergovernmental relations, which we've not touched on. But I can tell you that is an Achilles heel to the whole existence of the United Kingdom, because of it's a very unsatisfactory setup at the minute. But my very quick point in question is around ministers, because I think Jessie has kept coming back to this, and that's a point that I think needs to be focused on. A lot of this has got to do with the calibre of leadership. So I'm holding the SNP ministers to account in the Scottish Parliament. They're pretty hopeless. And so it's not surprising that they're getting very poor outcomes in terms of government performance. So my question is this: how do you create a more professional approach to approaching the role of a minister? How do you prepare people to do that? Is there a case, which is being made in other places, for ministers not necessarily having to sit in the legislature, but having to account to the legislature? So that way you improve the calibre of ministers. Because yes, you can put political appointees into key roles, but ultimately it's the leadership qualities and the effectiveness of ministers that will determine what actually happens next.
Excellent. Well, we very much agree with you at the Institute for Government. We've been trying to make an argument around, obviously there's a question for political parties around pipeline, selection of candidates and so on, but we very much are of the opinion, and it's great to hear you talking about this, Jessie, that these are really difficult jobs. You need high calibre people, and then you need to support them, you need to train them, you need to help them do the things that, of course, they haven't done before. They will bring certain sets of experience. That's something we've been trying to work on at the IFG. But Alex, I know you have views about the physical location of the civil service, so why don't you start with that one?
And I'll be very brief. But just to also say, agree on ministers and agree on the need to look at intergovernmental relationships and arrangements as well. But yes, Darlington and number 10. On number 10, good luck persuading Prime Minister to do it. And that tends to be, the seductiveness of the Black Door and the history of the building. And I do think that is important. It's important not to undervalue value the symbolism of the centre of British government and so on. So I mean, one of the things we suggested in here on number 10 was that you keep the front door and you keep the staterooms, but you try and sort of just knock through and make the whole environment more effective for modern day working. Question as to whether you could move it out of London. I think it's difficult for, you'd have to, that raises all sorts of questions about where the capital should be. On Darlington, very briefly, we've done a case study on this. It's on our website. It's been pretty successful. The key to Darlington's success was that it wasn't just saying, let's plonk these civil servants here without really thinking about who they were or the work that they're doing. It was a lot of effort went into making it a themed campus around the economy, not just Treasury civil servants, but from different departments. So it had a kind of mission and a sense of purpose, but that took a lot of overhead, a lot of effort, and it's also, there's a question about the extent to which the talent pipeline is able to sustain that campus and whether people are willing to build their careers there and move from the Treasury. So it's not, the campus is a good thing, but it's not a sort of a simple, it's not a simple thing to do, and it's definitely not an answer to kind of improving the state and policy making on its own basis.
Jesse, do you want to come in next, and then I'll let Eve and Caroline come in for some final thoughts before we wrap up?
Sure. So just very quickly, I mean, Darlington, we did Darlington when I was at the Treasury, and I'm thrilled to hear the results that you've described. That was how it has appeared to me since then, and in part for the reasons you described. A lot of the secret is getting really senior civil servants to go and head it up.
Yeah.
I mean, you've got Beth Russell, who's a second permanent secretary now at HMT. You've got a very senior civil servant who's decided they're going to put their career there. That's a fantastic decision by her, very bold, very brave, and she's had a fantastic life in Darlington, which she wouldn't have had if she'd lived in London. So it's absolutely not been a one-way ticket, and the test then will be to take the people who can't get are the 35 to 45-year-olders, because they tend to be established in London, kids in schools, stuff like that. So what you need to do is then recruit the high flyers at the level below, have them grow up, and then bring them back to London so that they don't feel that they are cut out of the kind of central chimney of advancement and capability. On number 10, of course, I quite like the fact that number 10 is small, because it stops the growth of prime ministerial pomposity and grandness. And I, of course, it's the wrong shape, but good luck with that one. On the issue of intergovernmental relations, of course, seems exactly right, and I hope that the Institute of Government will take a little cue to think about whether it could extend this work in that area.
My colleague Akash, who is sitting there in the audience, is our expert on that.
Very good, excellent, well done. I think on the question of ministers not sitting in either house, the accountability does go beyond just turning up for questions in Parliament and being in front of a select committee. The requirement, the ability to find a minister almost every vote most nights is a tangible form of accountability and, frankly, of immersion. And so, and of course, since I'm obsessive about accountability, I really think it's important. I just think we should have better quality ministers, and I think we can do that by the political parties doing their jobs better, and then by training them better, and by choosing people, mirabile dictu, who'd done something before they went into politics. But that's a seditious opinion that I don't expect to find any support for.
Caroline, just go on.
Yeah, I'll just do the number 10 question as someone who spent a very brief and not altogether pleasant stint in number 10. The building, I wouldn't like to see the very centre of government leave number 10. I think it's just a part of the British state that is just so symbolic, and everyone knows about it worldwide. It's just, to me, it's part of it. However, the building itself, beyond the nice rooms that you see on television, is in a real state. It urgently needs a facelift. And I'm not talking about sort of Johnson-era gold wallpaper or anything fancy like that, but I remember multiple video calls that I was on while I was in number 10 where I would have to leave the call or turn my camera off because the Wi-Fi doesn't work. So we really do need to get some sort of basic infrastructure into number 10 to keep things ticking over quickly. It's just it sludges up the pace of being able to get anything done if you have to leave really important calls because the internet's down again. So that's a really basic but important point. Also, there is chronic damp. There are rodents everywhere, and it does does need a facelift, but I wouldn't like to see it leave Downing Street.
Possibly the best symbol of modern Britain. Eve?
Yeah, I think I'll just wrap up really. I know we're at time, but just on the point about physical location, I think it's a nice place to finish for Onward as well. As you know, we're the think tank that has really driven forward a lot of the levelling up agenda and really ensuring that there is regeneration in parts of the country that need it, that we're not too London-centric. And it has been a really nice thing to see, I think, the success of some of these civil service campuses, particularly in Darlington, but I know there's also quite a lot of jobs that have moved to Manchester as well, which I think is really brilliant. It's helping move people out of the capital who have money to spend in those areas and, who are buying houses, and that's helping the housing market. A lot of knock-on impacts of that. So yeah, I think it's a good thing to highlight as we finish. One thing I would say, though, is just in my experience in civil service, I think a lot of the recruitment now to those locations, a lot of jobs are sort of location-blind recruitment. You can choose, you can be in any of those locations and do the same job. And I think that is a bit problematic in terms of doing the job efficiently, that perhaps we need to just say, these jobs are happening in Darlington, these jobs are happening in Manchester in terms of efficient operation. But yeah, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you to everyone for joining us for this event. And can I ask you to join me in thanking our excellent panel?
Thank you very much.